I was standing at a pedestrian crossing in Ginza recently, just watching the rhythm of the city. There's this specific, almost eerie silence when the light turns red. You have thousands of people waiting in this state of absolute synchronized patience. No one honks. No one jaywalks. It feels less like a city and, more like a high-precision watch that's been wound perfectly. Yeah. Every tile on the sidewalk is straight. Every vending machine is glowing with this clinical precision. And you get this overwhelming sense that everything is exactly where it's supposed to be. But then I saw a news update on a nearby screen about the deployment of Type 12 missile batteries in Okinawa. It felt like a sudden cold glitch in the simulation. Here we were, standing in this bubble of hyper-sanitized order, while just a few hundred miles away, the landscape was being hardened with cold, concrete, and anti-ship missiles pointed at the open sea. It made me realize that Japan isn't just a country. It's a massive silent transaction. Most nations build a military to project power or, to demand a seat at the global head table. But Japan seems to be doing something much more radical. They've entered into a deal that most proud nations would find, humiliating. They've traded away the traditional rights of a complete sovereign power, the right to lead international interventions, the right to move completely independently on the world stage for a very specific, tangible kind of freedom at home. They've traded the ghost of national glory for the reality of the perfect street. By accepting a comprehensive security umbrella and a state of limited geopolitical sovereignty, Japan has, in effect, outsourced its survival. It's a strategic choice. A choice that allows the state to focus with this monastic, almost pathological intensity on the micro-level daily life, infrastructure, the social fabric. While traditional powers hemorrhage their social cohesion and resources trying to influence the globe, Japan has turned its resources inward. They've used that peace dividend to build the world's most reliable sewage systems, the safest midnight walks, and a society so orderly it feels like it's been vacuum sealed away from the chaos of the 21st century. It forces you to look at those missile batteries in Okinawa not as weapons of war, but as the walls of a high-tech garden. They represent the ultimate insurance policy, and it raises a core question that challenges everything we think we know about national pride. Is the abstract thrill of being a complete sovereign power, able to fight your own wars and dictate global policy, actually worth the domestic cost? Or has Japan found a smarter, colder way to exist by sacrificing its status as a world leader just to ensure that a convenience store 500 miles away stays perfectly stocked, safe, and clean at 3 a.m.?
That opening paradox you're describing, that tension between the hyper-sanitized order and the cold military necessity, that's really the key to understanding modern Japan. We are looking at a society built on a fundamental strategic trade-off. It's a system where limited geopolitical sovereignty enables this hyper-focused investment in micro-governance and world-class public infrastructure.
Right. It's a system that's designed to protect the perfect street, but as we'll see, it comes with immense costs, both culturally and externally.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's unpack this silent transaction. Our mission for this deep dive is to really dig into that strategic choice, sacrificing the status of a complete sovereign power to gain the domestic freedom to focus relentlessly on perfection. We need to understand the mechanics of how it all works.
Precisely. And to understand how Japan functions, we really need to examine the architecture holding up this unique social order. So for our deep dive, we've broken it down into 3 pillars. First, there's the strategic bargain itself, the one that outsourced survival. Then there's the internal cultural engine that actually drives that hyper-sanitized order you saw. And finally, the civilizational outcome, which is, in a way, a redefined, very practical form of sovereignty.
Let's start with that foundation then. The great bargain, the geopolitical strategy that made this whole domestic experiment possible. Why did Japan choose to limit its own freedom of action on the world stage in the first place?
Well, it was born out of absolute necessity and, frankly, crushing defeat. Post-World War II, Japan's entire political structure was redefined by the U.S. occupation. Their policy became defined by a singular, intense focus: economic growth and recovery.
And nothing else.
Pretty much. This meant adhering strictly to the famous pacifist principles in Article 9 of the 1947 Peace Constitution, which, in its original interpretation, renounced war and the maintenance of military forces altogether.
So they were legally and morally boxed in.
Right.
They couldn't rebuild a military that could project force, even if they wanted to.
That's right. And they embraced this constraint strategically. It led to a very passive, very low-profile role in world affairs. Their guiding philosophy in foreign policy became something called omnidirectional diplomacy. It's a term from the 70s, but it reflects their behavior much earlier.
Omnidirectional diplomacy. What does that mean in practice?
It was essentially a policy of maintaining political neutrality, avoiding commitment to political blocs, while aggressively expanding economic relations wherever they could. They treated all nations as potential trading partners.
So it allowed them to prosper no matter what was happening with global politics. It was about maximizing economic opportunity while minimizing any political risk.
Exactly. And this policy was wildly successful. It fueled the economic miracle. But, and this is the critical part, it was only viable because the country enjoyed the robust security and economic stability provided by its ally, the United States.
Which brings us to the foundational document for all of this.
The Yoshida Doctrine.
Right. Adopted in the early 1950s, it cemented this trade-off. It's arguably the single most important strategic decision in modern Japanese history. Let's break down the three core tenets of that doctrine.
Sure. Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida was a master pragmatist, and he was instrumental in forging this path. The doctrine he championed rested on three core pillars that defined Japan's strategy for decades. First, an unwavering, firm alliance with the United States. This positioned Japan squarely within the Western sphere during the Cold War.
A clear choice. It makes sense to align with the victor and, at the time, the undisputed global power.
The second pillar, and this is the absolute core of the bargain, was a deliberate reliance on the American military shield and its nuclear umbrella.
So they didn't have to build their own.
Exactly. This allowed Japan to limit its domestic defense forces, the self-defense forces, or SDF, to an absolute minimum. They focused only on territorial defense, maybe some humanitarian tasks, and that kept defense spending extremely low.
Which means they could divert enormous state resources that would normally be spent on things like aircraft carriers and fighter jets.
And pour them directly into industry, into infrastructure, into education. It was a massive economic advantage.
And the third tenet.
That was the intense, almost singular emphasis on economic diplomacy in global affairs. Trade and investment, not military or political intervention, became the primary tool of foreign engagement. Japan became the quiet, powerful economic engine of Asia.
So the immediate security implication of this was, as you said, limited sovereignty. It meant U.S. forces could deploy in and around Japan. I have to imagine that wasn't always accepted easily by the Japanese public.
Oh, it was a continuous source of domestic friction. It still is, particularly regarding the U.S. military bases in Okinawa, which hosted and still host a massive concentration of American forces.
But a political establishment saw it as a necessary evil.
They saw it as the price of the bargain. This pact, which was formalized in the 1952 Security Treaty and then refined in 1960, entrusted national security entirely to the U.S. protective shield. It provided a powerful, ready framework against any military threats, especially from the Soviet Union and China at the time.
This security pact must have also profoundly dictated their diplomatic posture toward their regional neighbors, right? The ones who had suffered under Japanese imperialism. They couldn't exactly afford to be assertive.
They absolutely could not. Japan's diplomacy towards East and Southeast Asian neighbors became, by necessity, very low-key, very conciliatory, and non-assertive. A critical task for them was assuaging the deep suspicions and resentments caused by past aggression.
So how did they manage that?
Their diplomacy just avoided high-profile political issues altogether. It focused relentlessly on economic goals, like providing significant foreign assistance and investment tied to development.
So they're using economic aid as a way of, I guess, apologizing and building future relationships, a kind of policy of separation of politics and economics.
Yes, that's a great way to put it. They essentially said, we will help you build your economy, but we will not involve ourselves in your politics. It was a strategy to cultivate friendly ties universally, projecting this image of a benign, non-threatening economic giant.
And it worked for a time.
It worked brilliantly for recovery and growth, but it meant accepting a perpetual political backseat on the world stage.
But then we get to the 1990s, and that bargain starts to creak a little. By 1990, Japan's economic dominance was enormous. Did the U.S. start feeling like Japan was getting too good a deal?
They did. The 1980s and early 90s saw significant friction. From the U.S. perspective, Japan was free riding on security costs while simultaneously dominating global markets in areas like automobiles and consumer electronics.
I remember the headlines from that time.
Yeah, senior U.S. leaders were demanding a new conceptual framework to account for the altered strategic and economic realities. There was a lot of pressure for Japan to contribute more than just money to global security.
The idea being, if you're a global economic power, you have to shoulder global security responsibilities. Did internal opinion in Japan support that? Did they want to match that economic might with political and military status?
There was certainly a debate, especially among the political elites. They wanted a more prominent international role that was commensurate with the nation's economic power, its trade, its investments.
To the public.
The public consensus remained firmly in support of the structural military restraint. The fear of remilitarization and the potential domestic and regional instability it could cause, it was just too strong. The memory of the war was still very present.
So the economic muscle was flexing globally, but the military restraint was structural and cultural, and it was rooted in that 1960 security treaty. How did they reconcile that tension?
They leaned into what was sometimes dismissively termed checkbook diplomacy.
Right. Instead of sending troops, they sent money.
A lot of money. Japan massively increased its financial contributions to international efforts, like the Gulf War Coalition, even though that was still very controversial domestically. Officials also became more active in using their economic and financial resources to gain a greater voice in international political organizations, especially in Asia. But they still avoided a greater military role. The bargain remained intact, even if it was strained. Japan continued to prioritize domestic stability and economic strength over geopolitical assertiveness.
So that structural choice, that stability purchased by outsourcing survival, is the foundation. But stability only matters if you have a system to utilize it. Which brings us to the second pillar, the engine of order. This internal collective mindset where trust itself seems to function as public infrastructure.
This is the cultural mechanism that translates that geopolitical stability into the hyperorder you observed in Ginza. The entire system is built on this concept of trust functioning not just as a social lubricant, but as a literal public infrastructure.
Let's go back to that perfect illustration you mentioned. The tiny, unguarded glass box, the vending machine in a Tokyo alley at 2:17 a.m.
It's a beautifully silent transaction, isn't it? The machine contains cash and valuable goods, often sitting unlocked or locked with what seem to be pretty rudimentary measures. In a low-trust city, that machine is an immediate target. It wouldn't last the night.
No way.
But in Tokyo, it just hums quietly. It's protected not primarily by physical locks, but by the soft power of social expectation. And this expectation acts as an invisible architecture of security.
It requires an almost perfect statistical guarantee that the vast majority of people will not only leave it alone, but will actively ensure others do too.
Precisely. And we can crystallize this idea with the anecdote you shared about Liam, the expat designer. He forgets his brand new expensive MacBook Pro on a public bench outside a convenience store.
Which is a modern person's worst nightmare. In many places, that laptop is just gone.
Yeah.
Instantly monetized.
But when Liam rushes back, the key insight isn't just that it wasn't stolen. That's amazing in itself. The really profound part is that a complete stranger had actively taken the laptop and placed it inside a plastic shopping bag to protect it from the morning dew and potential rain.
It was an act of preservation.
That is the perfect word for it. It wasn't passive respect, it was active stewardship. That stranger engaged in an act of civic maintenance. They treated valuable private property as if it were part of the shared public space that needed to be looked after. The responsibility for order extends beyond community property. It encompasses protecting the individual assets within that shared environment to prevent any disruption or damage.
So if the security isn't coming from police or from locks, where does this hyper-responsible mindset come from? What's the origin?
Well, the foundation is the deep cultural homogeneity. When the overwhelming majority of your citizens share the same ethnicity, the same rigorously structured schooling, and the same historical narratives and social protocols, they develop what amounts to a highly synchronized moral operating system.
That synchronization most drastically simplifies social interaction.
It generates extremely high levels of what sociologists call social capital. There is a default, powerful assumption that people can intuitively understand and predict the actions, motivations, and expectations of others. You don't need excessive external policing or, explicit rules for every minor interaction.
Because the default cultural setting is already geared toward mutual consideration and maintaining harmony.
Right. It simplifies compliance enforcement through peer pressure and a deeply internalized sense of shame. That high level of conformity drastically reduces the statistical likelihood of you encountering an outlier, the person who would steal the cash from the vending machine or take the MacBook Pro. It guarantees a sufficient percentage of adherence to the unwritten rules, making society predictable and therefore secure.
When you mentioned this as a double-edged sword, the same homogeneity that protected Liam's laptop is what built an invisible wall that excluded him. Let's talk about Liam's experience when he tried to renew his apartment lease.
Right. His landlord refused to renew his lease, even though he was a perfect tenant, financially stable, never caused problems, and the landlord explicitly said they preferred the cultural and behavioral predictability of a Japanese tenant.
So they chose predictability over proven financial certainty.
Yes. The safety and order are the perks of a club, and that deep homogeneity is the barrier to entry. It underscores that while the system creates exceptional public safety, it is often secured through a deeply exclusive internal focus. The trust is high, but it's not universally applied.
And this high trust system isn't new. You mentioned that we have sources tracing this back to pre-modern collective economic structure.
Absolutely. The historical precedent is essential to understanding this. We can look back at collective economic structures like Tanamashiko, also known as Mujin or Moai. These were rotating savings and credit associations, and they've been running since the 12th century during the Kamakura period.
So this was basically a precursor to local banking for common people who had no access to established financial institutions. How did they work?
Typically, a group of neighbors or merchants would agree to contribute a set amount of money regularly. Then, on a rotating basis, one member would receive the total lump sum.
And crucially, the entire system
ran purely on mutual personal trust. There were no formalized contracts, no collateral, and no legal recourse if someone defaulted.
So what was the enforcement mechanism? What guaranteed compliance?
The guarantee was purely social. It was the members' personal accountability within that tight-knit community and the immense career-ending, life-altering shame or haji of breaking that trust. If you defaulted, it meant total social exclusion for you and your entire family.
So this multi-century habit of deep local mutual accountability, secured by shame, fed directly into the modern understanding of shared public responsibility.
Exactly. It created a cultural expectation of group loyalty and financial responsibility that long predates the modern state structure. Criminological studies often tie Japan's low crime rate and high compliance directly to this history of locality-based group formation.
The community becomes its own police force.
In a way, yes, through shared internalized expectations. When your security, your financial well-being, and your identity are all tied to your immediate neighbors, it produces these informal behavioral expectations. Analysts have called them an infinite number of repressive rules that enforce incredibly high self-control.
So if homogeneity is the foundation, and Tanamashiko is the historical root, then the absolute core engine driving this massive self-control in modern society is the concept of miwaku.
Miwaku. Causing trouble, being a burden, or inconveniencing others. This is the core social governor. It's a concept that dominates the daily psychological labor in Japan. Its function is to ensure that the collective social harmony, known as wa, always takes precedence over individual liberty that might inconvenience even one other person.
So it's not just about being polite. It's a profound, proactive fear of introducing any friction into the system.
It is preemptive psychological labor aimed at maintaining equilibrium. And the anecdote of Kenji, the stressed salaryman, perfectly illustrates the depth of this internalization. It's 1 a.m, he's exhausted, walking home down a totally empty street. He accidentally drops a single 100-yen coin, and it rolls under a vending machine.
Right. And most people would do a quick cost-benefit analysis. 100 yen is less than $1. The 5 minutes of effort it would take to get it outweighs the monetary value. You just leave it.
But Kenji spends 5 full minutes on his hands and knees trying to retrieve that single coin. Why? Because leaving it isn't just about losing money, it's a disruption of order. It's a tiny crack in the perfect streetscape. To leave it there, even on an empty street, is to risk causing miwaku to the abstract concept of order itself. He cannot be the one to introduce an imperfection.
That's fascinating. It reframes public order as a continuous collective action. Every citizen is a janitor, actively maintaining a pristine environment.
And that insight leads directly to what some have termed reverse broken windows theory.
Okay, explain that.
Well, the traditional theory suggests that signs of disarray, a broken window, graffiti invite further decay and criminality. The Japanese example shows the opposite. Immaculate upkeep actively suppresses the impulse to deface the space. If the environment is uniformly perfect, the psychological barrier to being the first person to disrupt that perfection is incredibly high.
And we see this relentless psychological labor, this constant avoidance of miwaku play out in dozens of rigid, unwritten rules in daily public life.
Yes, and this is the cost of perfection. Think about public transit. The rigid control of conversation volume on trains is legendary.
Phone calls are basically forbidden.
Deeply frowned upon, almost banned on crowded trains. Your private noise infringes on the shared quiet space, which is a violation of WWII. Similarly, you rarely see people eating or drinking on commuter trains because potential crumbs, spills, or smells are all forms of miwaku.
And the famously frustrating lack of public trash cans. In most cities, that would lead to immediate littering.
But the underlying cultural logic dictates that if you create trash, it is your personal responsibility to hold on to it, package it neatly, and dispose of it properly at home or at your destination. Leaving litter is an immense, unforgivable miwaku.
Even something like wearing a mask when you're sick.
It's not primarily about your personal health. It's an act of consideration for the collective. It's a civic duty to prevent spreading germs to the group. It's all about minimizing friction and maintaining a highly cooperative, synchronized social dance.
That sounds wonderful for public civility, but also incredibly exhausting. Especially when that pressure transfers into a system as high stress as the modern corporate workplace.
It's precisely where social harmony collides head-on with burnout and individual welfare. The fear of causing miwaku at work is one of the primary drivers of overwork.
So people stay late not because they have to, but because leaving would cause trouble.
Exactly. People stay late not necessarily because they have critical, time-sensitive tasks to finish, but because leaving on time while others are still working is considered bad form. It's a breach of the unspoken contract that implies you are prioritizing your personal life over the collective effort.
The ultimate individual sacrifice for the stability of the group. And it must create a culture where even victims are reluctant to speak up.
It is. The high cultural weight placed on group stability means that victims of workplace harassment or bullying often choose silence. They are unwilling to create a scene, file a complaint, or initiate a conflict that would disrupt the status quo. In those scenarios, the overarching requirement of group stability clearly overrides the need for individual justice. It's a very costly psychological performance to maintain the endurance of flawless operation.
That intense inward focus protecting the microenvironment at almost any cost leads us perfectly into the third dimension of this system, the strategic consequence of that isolation, which the business world has a great name for.
The Galapagos Syndrome. It's a fascinating analogy.
You like Darwin's finches.
Exactly. Like Darwin's isolated species that evolved to be perfectly adapted to their unique islands, but were incompatible with the global mainland. It describes Japanese technology and industrial systems that evolve in isolation for hyper-specific domestic needs, which then leads to eventual global incompatibility.
The classic example is always the mobile phones of the early 2000s.
The Garakai, or feature phones. Technologically, they were years ahead of the West. They had mobile wallets, high-resolution cameras, and 3G data capabilities long before the iPhone was even conceived. But they were a dead end.
Why?
Because the operating systems and the proprietary network protocols were so customized for local carriers and local taste that they just couldn't scale or easily interface with the global GSM standard that dominated the rest of the world.
So their engineering genius and localized perfection ultimately failed them on the global market. The same intense focus that created order at home created economic insularity abroad.
And this insularity continues in core infrastructure today. It shows that prioritizing the domestic ecosystem is a structural default. Take the banking system. Japan has nearly 190,000 ATMs, yet for years, the vast majority, as high as 90%, did not accept foreign bank cards.
Which is baffling for the world's third largest economy.
Completely baffling. Even with government pressure to change, the system's default setting is to prioritize the seamless convenience of the domestic user over any kind of global integration.
And the key cars are another perfect example of policy reinforcing this structural isolation.
Right. The light vehicles, with engines strictly capped under 660 cc. This industry is protected by government policy. It offers substantial tax breaks and parking advantages to promote affordable, efficient local transport, particularly in crowded cities and rural areas.
So it creates this hyper-specialized domestic market.
A market where manufacturers excel. But these vehicles are often not profitable or viable for export because they fail to meet international safety or highway driving standards. The policy intentionally nurtures the local industry by sealing it off from global competition, which just reinforces that domestic focus.
So isolation creates incompatibility. But this seems to be the very isolation that allows them to pursue an alternative, maybe more profound kind of modernity, a focus on quality and depth over aggressive global market share.
That's the silver lining. That's the other side of the coin. The strategic isolation provides the necessary space to pursue monozukuri.
Which means spirit of craftsmanship.
Right. It's an ethos that rejects disposable consumerism and demands absolute dedication to the production process.
We see this in the story of Mr. Tanaka, the vintage electronics repairman.
His shop is an economic anomaly. It's cash-only, slow, and focuses on obsolete technology like 40-year-old cassette players. To a Western business consultant driven by ROI and speed, his business model is a complete failure. But he's prioritizing preserving the functional object and what he calls a human speed of life over maximizing profit. He's embodying monozukuri.
And this ethos scales up. It's not just small shops. We see it in the global strengths of big Japanese corporations.
We do. The commitment to monozukuri allows them to endure decades of trials and financial losses on things like specialty chemicals, high-grade glass, or advanced materials. A typical Western company focused on quarterly shareholder results would have cut those projects immediately.
But the Japanese commitment creates deep accumulated expertise.
Exactly. Profound market moats that are nearly impossible for competitors to replicate in the short term. They accept financial loss today for generational market dominance tomorrow.
But that obsession with perfection, the very thing that makes monozukuri so powerful, seems to have a destructive dark side, a pressure that leads to these damaging scandals we've seen.
This is the anti-pragmatism at work. We've seen a string of high-profile quality testing scandals in major manufacturing sectors. Kobe Steel, Toray Industries. Crucially, analysis often suggests these weren't about covering up legally dangerous flaws that might cause consumer harm.
So what were they about?
They stemmed from an obsession with excessive internal standards that were far beyond any international legal or safety requirements.
So the pressure wasn't to meet the law, but to meet some idealized, impossible internal standard of perfection.
Exactly. The moral imperative to uphold the principle of monozukuri absolute precision was so overwhelming that when staff occasionally failed to meet that internal standard, they felt compelled to falsify inspection results, even though the product already met or exceeded the actual global legal requirement. The moral requirement for absolute principle overruled the business reality of pragmatism.
That anti-pragmatism sounds wildly inefficient.
It is. You see it in anecdotes from small businesses where staff will spend hours looking for a 1-cent accounting error. Why? Because the cultural value of absolute precision and balance must win out over a cost-benefit analysis. The labor cost involved in fixing the error is irrelevant compared to the cultural violation of allowing the ledger to be imperfect.
This inward focus, this obsession with structural isolation, it must have roots that predate the 20th century. It feels like it reaches back to when Japan first encountered the external world.
It traces back directly to the Tokugawa shogunate's closed country policy, Sakoku. It ran for over 200 years, from the early 17th century to the mid-19th. The initial primary goal was domestic stability, ending a century of civil war by eliminating external ideological influences, particularly militant Christianity.
And for a long time, historians viewed this as simple, regressive isolationism, Japan just sticking its head in the sand.
But modern scholars now see it as a highly sophisticated strategic framework for selective engagement, not total isolation. The shogunate rigorously limited contact to specific groups, the Dutch, Chinese, Koreans, at specific points like Nagasaki.
And crucially, they selectively adopted Western advancements.
Yes, primarily through rangaku, or Dutch learning.
What were they selecting for? What knowledge did they want?
They adopted Western medicine, military science, cartography, and astronomy, all while rigorously limiting political and ideological influence. They were modernizing, but on their own terms. They controlled the pace and the nature of the change.
Which enabled Japan to build the intellectual and military groundwork to avoid what happened to so many of its neighbors.
It allowed it to avoid the colonial pressures that afflicted the region, and it prepared the stage for the incredibly rapid, successful modernization of the Meiji Restoration after 1868. The legacy of Sakoku of managed insulation still echoes in the Galapagos Syndrome today.
This entire complex structure, the geopolitical bargain, the cultural engine, the resulting isolation, it culminates in what we've been calling the civilizational fortress model. Let's look at the result through the eyes of the modern citizen who benefits from this structure.
We can look at someone like Daiki, the young salaryman. He lives in the result of that great transition. A society that surrendered imperial ambition and the abstract glory of a complete sovereign state to secure the very tangible sanctity of the individual. When he walks home through Shinjuku at 3 a.m. and feels no tension, no fear of violent crime, the city feels like a fortress of convenience.
So the ultimate national triumph isn't winning a war, it's providing the luxury of walking home alone at night without a worry.
It's a profound, redefined form of national success. The modern fortress is built of safety, predictable daily life, and urban convenience. It shifts the entire conversation away from traditional nationalist anxieties about a lost warrior spirit and demonstrates that the ultimate rational goal of any advanced civilization is a transition from the violence of the state to the peace and security of the citizen. The bargain, viewed through Daiki's daily experience, is incredibly rational.
And this forces us to contrast the West's definition of freedom sharply with East Asia's. In the West, freedom is often defined by abstract rights, freedom from restriction, freedom to protest even, well, even a tolerance for socially destructive behaviors.
This tolerance for dysfunction, which you can see in open drug use or visible social degradation in some U.S. urban centers, is framed by critics as a pathological tolerance that actively erodes the social fabric. The system prioritizes the individual's right to behave destructively over the collective's right to a safe, clean, shared public space.
Whereas the East Asian model, including Japan's, is focused on delivered security.
The tangible, practical freedom from vigilance and fear. The freedom to safely exist in public space at any hour of the day. In this model, order is not the enemy of liberty, it is the absolute prerequisite of liberty. Without a baseline of comprehensive, predictable order, freedom is just meaningless rhetoric. It's chaos disguised as choice.
And this relentless commitment to order translates into a significant advantage in governance efficacy, the ability to actually execute complex, multi-decade projects, which contrasts sharply with what you see as Western procedural paralysis.
Absolutely. The Western system often suffers from what's called a vetocracy. It's a structural disease where any single actor, a lawsuit, a NIMBY group, a single partisan legislator can veto action. It makes the process of approval and litigation more sacred than the desired outcome.
And this leads to complex infrastructure projects being stalled for decades.
For decades, resulting in massive cost overruns, high-speed rail, major housing developments. It's a cold calculation of competence. The East Asian approach prioritizes delivery.
It allows for what you call meritocratic execution.
Yes. By simplifying the veto points, experts and administrators are empowered to deliver complex, multi-decade results swiftly and efficiently. The state is structurally engineered to think in terms of decades and centuries. It prioritizes engineering competence over immediate partisan political squabbling. The promises made to the people are delivered visibly within a single generation.
We can see this commitment to competence most clearly in the paradox of policing, how they achieve incredible order with relatively minimal resources compared to other developed nations.
You have to look at the numbers. High-crime U.S. cities often maintain extremely high ratios. New York City, for example, fields around 840 uniformed officers per 100,000 residents.
And Tokyo.
Tokyo, despite its density, fields only about 320 officers per 100,000. That's less than half, yet it achieves vastly lower crime rates, especially violent crime. So quantity does not equate to prevention efficiency.
So the quality of integration and the model of policing must matter more than the quantity of boots on the ground. How is that integration achieved?
Through geographical allocation and deep community integration, specifically the Koban or police boxes. These aren't just remote stations. They are spatially pervasive, small, localized hubs, often staffed by just a few officers.
And they're not just for crime.
Not at all. They function as comprehensive safety services, offering directions, handling lost and found, maintaining local census and demographic data. They're built on familiarity and trust, acting as a visible, predictable fixture in the neighborhood.
So the Koban acts as a proactive deterrent based on trust and omnipresence rather than a reactive enforcement unit built on force.
That's right. And this integrated spatial arrangement fundamentally impacts the nature of crime. In the U.S. model, violent crime is heavily concentrated in geographically distinct hotspots, almost always linked to entrenched socioeconomic inequality. In Japan, while overall rates are quantitatively far lower, crime is much more ubiquitously distributed geographically. It shows no strong correlation with areas of socioeconomic disparity.
Which challenges the rigid association between neighborhood poverty and violent crime that defines so much of U.S. urban life.
Exactly. The Japanese model achieves a kind of post-hotspot scenario through effective neighborhood integration and resource allocation.
But this entire system, designed to stabilize and protect the perfect street, was purchased at the price of traditional sovereignty. And that original bargain relying on a foreign security umbrella introduces an unavoidable high-stakes tension when external threats heat up, particularly in East Asia.
Precisely. The cost of outsourcing survival becomes immediately apparent when we look at high-stakes conflicts, such as the cross-strait politics involving Taiwan. Any conflict there directly implicates Japan's strategic security. It threatens its vital sea lanes of communication and the security of its southern islands like Okinawa. This conflict forces a reckoning with that core choice: deterrence versus accommodation.
Let's look at the argument for accommodation first. It's a pragmatic, cost-saving approach, often favored by certain political factions.
The accommodation argument prioritizes immediate stability. Proponents argue that building closer economic and political ties like during the quiet diplomatic years under Taiwan's ex-president Ma Ying-jeou reduces the risk of war by increasing mutual interdependence. The core belief is that accommodation acts as a necessary pressure relief valve. It reduces the chances of accidental conflict triggered by miscalculation or aggressive posturing. In this view, economic entanglement is a guarantee of peace.
But the critique of that approach, particularly from those advocating stronger resistance, is incredibly harsh. They frame accommodation as strategically suicidal.
Opponents argue that the opposing power's ultimate stated goal is outright domination and annexation, not genuine peaceful coexistence. Therefore, accommodation is seen as just reducing resistance and speeding up the timeline for an invasion. They argue that in the current geopolitical climate, a peaceful rise is often perceived by an expansionist power as a sign of weakness. Historically, appeasement rarely leads to long-term peace. It simply lowers the perceived cost of military action and forces a larger conflict later on.
So the deterrence argument is the direct opposite. You have to increase the cost of a successful invasion until it becomes politically or militarily unfeasible.
Correct. The only way to delay or prevent an invasion is through rapid self-strengthening, building asymmetric defense capabilities, a porcupine strategy, and crucially, forging stronger alliances with major democratic powers like the US, Japan, Australia, and the EU. This strategy focuses on constantly raising the perceived cost of what would be a historic military victory sought by the opposing power, thus shifting their risk calculation dramatically.
This high-stakes tension also forces a reckoning with the historical context of political choices. When a nation chooses its path, how should historical crimes or long-term behavioral patterns factor into present-day political choices?
It's a complex ethical and strategic question, but the sources we looked at offer a pragmatic lens, evaluating a political party's long-term resume. While past historical crimes must be remembered, the core strategic concern is when a political party's current pattern of alliances aligns with openly authoritarian regimes responsible for massive ongoing human rights abuses or genocidal acts.
Meaning, the question isn't just about historical apology, but about current trustworthiness and alignment with global norms.
Exactly. For instance, critics would argue that aligning with a regime responsible for mass atrocities demonstrates a deeply problematic pattern of strategic choices and ideological alignment. They'd say it disqualifies that party from being entrusted with national security and democratic fate today. It's a pragmatic assessment of trustworthiness based on behavioral patterns and strategic risk, not just on rhetoric.
And finally, the goal of escaping great power politics, of navigating survival without becoming a pawn, is that even possible for states like Japan and Taiwan in today's transactional world?
The consensus among realpolitik analysts is that complete independence from major powers is largely an illusion in the modern transactional world. Every nation exists within spheres of influence. The key is to avoid becoming a vassal state through unconditional surrender, which results in a total loss of sovereignty.
Instead, countries have to aim to be a strategic asset or an active transactional partner.
That's the goal. Japan and Taiwan, for instance, are not simply passive pawns when they accept security guarantees and forge stronger trade ties with their allies. They are engaging in a highly advantageous transaction where they extract substantial benefits, security, technology access, geopolitical stability in return for their alliance position. Survival in this context requires balancing deterrence, diplomacy, and economic relevance without ever assuming you can escape great power politics altogether.
So synthesizing everything we've analyzed today, the bargain, the culture, the isolation, and the tension, what is the final takeaway regarding Japan's unique form of modernity?
The synthesis is this: Japan's exceptional order and high civility, the unguarded glass box, the perfect street, the safety of the individual, is secured because its citizens willingly internalize an extreme, constant degree of self-restraint. They prioritize the collective over the individual. They accept the psychological and economic cost of miwaku and monozukuri.
And this is a stability that was nurtured by deep cultural homogeneity and a legacy of strategic isolation, all purchased through the geopolitical trade-off of the Yoshida Doctrine.
And it results in a truly distinct form of modernity. Order isn't a consequence of external locks or heavy enforcement or overwhelming state violence. It is a consequence of voluntary self-imprisonment by the collective, a profound, costly, and remarkable social contract that fundamentally redefines what a nation-state can achieve when it focuses inward.